I think we'll commence this session. These sessions are always very brief, so we'll get started at the earliest opportunity. For the purposes of the witnesses and the public, there hasn't been a coup. Our convener is actually detained in the chamber and members' business. And under standing orders, the oldest member present, a cruel way to put it, must chair the meeting for the purpose of choosing a temporary convener, and that is why I've taken the chair. Can I have nominations for a temporary convener, please?
I nominate
John.
myself to remain in situ.
Thanks very much. Anybody object? Okay, thanks very much. We'll move on to the formal start of the meeting. This is the fourth meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing in 2014. Could all switch off mobile phones and other electronic devices completely? We've had no apologies, and welcome Roderick Campbell, who joins us today. Item 1, decision on taking business in private. Subcommittee is invited to agree to take item 3, consideration of our work programme in private. Are all members content to item 3? Item 2, local policing. The main item of business today, evidence session on local policing. And today we will hear from Deputy Chief Constable Rose Fitzpatrick and colleagues on the issues raised in written evidence and during our visits in relation to local policing. I welcome to the meeting from Police Scotland Deputy Chief Constable Rose Fitzpatrick, QPM, Local Policing, Assistant Chief Constable Campbell Thompson, Local Policing North, Assistant Chief Constable Mike McCormick, Local Policing East, Assistant Chief Constable Wayne Mawson, Local Policing West, and Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen, Local Policing Commander for Fife Division. We will have questions, obviously, from members, but you might want to make a statement to begin, and we're happy to receive that now. Ms Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much, Convener and Committee, for the opportunity to come and add to the work that you've been doing going around the country, looking at local policing as we reach almost the first year of Police Scotland. Clearly, we are now a national police service, but I am very confident that we remain supremely local in nature. I can say that because we're connected to our communities more than we have ever been, I think. We, this year, have consulted 31,000 people across Scotland and our community planning partners, community councils and so on the priorities for them for this year. And the priorities are broadly similar to the ones that they identified for us last year. But of course, we've increased our consultation this year from 19,600 to that 31,000. We have 353 multi-member ward plans, and we're shaping those now for the coming year. That's more than we've ever had across Scotland, and we continue to have our 32 local policing plans linked to the single outcome agreements locally. And partnerships, as I'm sure you will have found already, are strong and thriving, involving shared services, shared planning, and new features, for example, our MATACs and MARACs, managing victims and perpetrators of, for example, domestic abuse across Scotland. We're providing better services to our communities by being organised in a different way, at which local policing absolutely remains at the heart. So we have almost 13,000 police officers across Scotland directly engaged in local policing. And we recently published figures which demonstrated that all of those officers are supported by officers arranged regionally in North, East and West, and those very small number of officers who are at the core, if you like, the central services, and all of those, whether regional or national, are deployed daily to support local policing. So, for example, our Operational Support Division in the first 11 months of Police Scotland has provided an extra 42,250 days of policing in support of local divisions across the country. And I'd simply finish by saying that how do we know that local policing is still at the heart of what we're doing and is still being successful in keeping people safe? Because it is keeping people safe and safer than it has been in previous years. We're tackling those public priorities, and we're doing it in a way which means that violence across the country, we've seen over 700 fewer victims of violence. Antisocial behaviour and disorder, which we know are local priorities. Antisocial behaviour calls down 50,000 across the country, and disorder down 60,000 fewer incidents in the first 11 months. And at the bottom of all of that, public confidence and satisfaction remain high. We survey over 1,200 people every month, and we ask them, when we dealt with your incident, how well did we do? And I would say that the figures that we're getting back from the public demonstrate the sort of levels of satisfaction that many other public services would envy. So, for example, and I'll give you the high-level figure, which is that over 82% of people satisfied overall with the policing service they get. And as we know, that policing service is, by and large, delivered entirely by local policing, supported by central and specialist services.
Thanks very much for that. I'll go straight to John Finney, and Kevin's acknowledged that he would like to follow.
Thank you. Good afternoon, panel. Very reassuring words from you, Ms Fitzpatrick. Supremely local policing at heart. Yet we're continually here. It's done the Strathclyde way or no way, or more particularly done the Glasgow way or no way. What discretion is there, understanding the need for commonality across the country with some things? What is there local discretion?
Every single officer across Scotland still continues to have at the heart of their policing toolkit discretion. And we know that that's the case because they exercise it every single day. I'm asked this question from time to time about discretion, and it seems to me a good way of describing that is to acknowledge that in many areas a national service has enabled us to be much clearer about a consistent level of service to the public in certain particular problems that we tackle. So if I could use examples from both ends of the spectrum, if you like. So domestic abuse. You'll know that it's a very high-level priority for us, tackling domestic abuse, supporting victims and robustly tackling perpetrators. But what we saw in 8 legacy forces across the country was a variation in interpretation about what that meant. So every officer dealing with a domestic abuse incident continues to have discretion about how they deal with it, but we have been very clear what our expectation is in terms of police action. So now when an officer goes to a call, which might be a call to a disturbance in a house or a flat, what we expect them to do is to treat that as an investigation from the start. We expect them to go to the premises. We don't expect them to take the word of an individual who comes to the door when they can see beyond them in the hallway signs of a disturbance. We expect them to investigate it robustly, to satisfy themselves that there is no woman or children who obviously is distressed in the premises. It wasn't happening consistently.
The local dimension. I mean, I can understand a conscious decision to target the pernicious thing that is domestic violence. And it wasn't so much on individual cases, but, you know, I represent a large landward area, the Highlands and Islands, where, you know, big areas of it, people are not concerned about armed robbery, for instance, just to give an extreme example. So what autonomy is given to local commanders to address the issues? And I know you'll say the policing plan, but still people keep saying it's a Strathclyde way, we're being told.
Well, the discretion issue remains in terms of local officers. The other end of the scale I would describe is an issue around seatbelts. I would entirely expect officers to deal with what's in front of them using their discretion. If it's the first time they spot a local person not using their seatbelt, then to give them advice and explain to them why it's important for their own safety. If it's the second or third time, I would ask them to tackle it in a way which encourages people to see it's an important issue. And of course, your point about discretion for local commanders to tackle the things that are important locally. In many areas across Scotland, as you describe, robbery is not an issue, and it doesn't feature in the local plans for that reason. But where it is an issue, it becomes a local priority that we tackle.
And the issue of targets, which is another recurring theme we hear. Can you explain? Are there targets? Who set them? Against what criteria? And what's the purpose of the targets?
We have a performance framework which includes targets and it includes performance indicators. And it exists simply and solely for the purpose of deciding whether we are, and being able to monitor and manage whether we are meeting the priorities that people set for us locally and that we set out in our plans, whether we're deploying our resources and our people and they're being effective in the right places at the right times, whether they've got the skills to do what they need to do. So what the targets and the indicators are there to do are to help us, as senior people in the organisation, establish, are we really focused on keeping people safe? The targets, there are no targets set for individual officers, and I would expect right across the board, and I'm hoping that Chief Superintendent McEwan will be able to describe the local context for this, that it's senior managers across the organisation who understand what the priorities are, what they need to do to tackle those things, and who are accountable through their divisional commanders for the way they use their resources to do that. And Chief Superintendent McEwan might want to give an example of how that operates locally.
Certainly, ma'am, I could do that. Just touching on the discretion discussion, because this is something that I regularly talk through my local officers. Me and my command team go out once a week, go to a briefing or a debriefing, and discretion absolutely is something that we reinforce. It's fundamental to policing in Scotland, the use of discretion, and whether it be in campaigns against violence, when I'm out working with officers and we come across individuals that are rowdy, you know, discretion is used there. We don't criminalise people for the sake of criminalising them. I can think of recent initiatives, mobile alcohol intervention team that we have in place, which is a multi-agency team in Fife, which actually has seen us refer 802 under 18-year-olds that have been under the influence of alcohol and or committing antisocial behaviour, referring them to partner agencies rather than actually charging them with a criminal offence. So actually discretion, I would suggest, is at the forefront of our mind, and we should use it proportionately and when discretion is relevant. I think we have to be wary about discretion, however, about it's not an excuse for an officer to turn a blind eye to a criminal act that's ongoing. And, you know, the Deputy touched on domestic abuse, and actually that was something, domestic abuse in Fife and Legacy Fife Constabulary, we sat with a conversion rate, and what that means is a conversion rate of incidents reported, domestic incidents reported to crime conversion of only 20%. And it wasn't, I had a discussion with a retired Chief Superintendent before I took up post, and other areas were hitting well above that. And what did that mean to me? That meant that actually some of our officers were overly using discretion when it came in relation to domestic abuse. And our conversion rate now in Fife is 60%. So we've tripled that conversion rate. So more serial offenders are being incarcerated for serious sexual offences at times. And the support is there for the victim. So I think discretion is vitally important. We utilise it and it's proportionate, but we need to be careful that we don't overindulge with that and turn a blind eye to crime. The targets, I have targets. My targets are clear. My targets are to reduce robbery. My targets are to reduce serious assault. My overarching target is to keep people in Fife safe, and that is absolutely what me and my senior command team are focused on. My constables, my sergeants do not have any personal targets. They go out with that mantra, which is to go out there and keep the people of Fife safe, to put in place early interventions for persons who we suspect may be intent on violence or drug dealing within our communities, and we put in place measures to try and prevent that from happening through other stop and search, high-vis patrols, intelligence-led turns, and that's what we do in Fife to keep people safe, but there are absolutely no targets for officers or sergeants.
That's very reassuring. Just a final question, if I may, Convener, and it does relate to the figure you gave there, and I can't recall the term you said about converting calls into. Is there a danger, given a focus, that in doing that process there and encouraging, and everyone would want robust action taken against perpetrators of domestic violence, that by ensuring there is that robustness, you've actually removed discretion? People have rows in houses. It doesn't mean that there's domestic violence. Have you removed that discretion? Because as I understand, increasingly it's not just there are two alleged perpetrators being arrested from a dwelling because there's counter-accusations come in, and we wouldn't want to lose the ability to decide that something is a minor shouting match, albeit there may be more behind it. I'm not.
Yeah, You're right, but if you think of the 60% figures, there's then 40% where our officers are still using discretion. You know, an example that hit home to me a number of months ago, and I've spoken to my local councillors about this, but it was in sort of April, May of last year when we'd recently embarked upon Police Scotland, where there was a female, as it was, who had phoned the police, or her sister actually phoned the police to say that my sister has just been injured, but her partner is away from the house. The police arrived. The victim refused to give a statement. The police left. And then what happened was, an hour later, the police returned to the house and said to the victim, I know you didn't give us a statement, but we've now incarcerated, we've now locked up your partner, we've detained him just now, and we'd like to make sure you're safe, make some referrals and discuss this with you. And she broke down and then actually talked about years, decades of sexual abuse, and the question was put to her, why have you never told us before? And she says, well, you've never actually locked him up before, you know, and I now feel safe because he's behind bars. And actually, some of the abuse that she then went on to tell us about, a number of calls that the police had been alerted to, and we hadn't actually taken the right action. So I'm confident 60% is the right thing, and certainly in Fife, and the right thing for the people of Fife.
Avoidance of doubt, I commend the robust action.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Kevin, followed by Alison.
Thank you, Convener. And John has concentrated in an area where he thinks that one area of Scotland is influencing what is going on. I want to concentrate on how we ensure that best practice is exported throughout the country. And I'm going to be a bit parochial, Convener. It'll come as no surprise to some committee members. And look,
So out of character.
And look at the Grampian situation. And Mr Finney and I visited Elgin recently and spoke with a number of members of the community. And even till we probed them, they seem to have nothing but praise for the local police in the area. And a lot of that, I think, was down to the success in terms of communication that there was between officers and between communities. And a lot of that sprang from Platform for Success in the former Grampian area. Beyond that, multi-member ward plans. Folk thought that they had a real influence in shaping what the police were doing in their area. I think other colleagues may have had different experiences in other parts of the country, and I'll let them deal with that. But how do we ensure that level of communication, that level of listening from the public is exported right across the country? Can I ask how you're doing that at this moment in time?
Just before you answer, I'll leave the chair
Sorry about that.
and hand it back to our convener. But please, on you go.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to answer that, because actually the main mechanism, if you like, for doing that are the people seated with me here round the table, our divisional commanders and the assistant chief constables, who operate as, if you like, a single team, but delivering local policing according to local need. So we've taken already in the first year of Police Scotland a number of ideas and initiatives from around the country, and we've put those to divisional commanders as a group and asked them to think about them individually, to have an influence on how they might operate elsewhere. And then where we've reached an agreement and understanding that the best practice can be something which is available to everybody locally and nationally right across the country, then we've introduced toolkits for officers, which are the best practice wherever we find it, which are constantly updated. We've introduced some new systems like our Vulnerable Persons database, which has taken an idea which I believe came from the legacy North East Grampian force. We're now about to finish rolling out an interim version of that right across the country, so that for the first time we're able to track vulnerable people and perpetrators right across the country. So what we do is we bring all of those things together, and then we road test them, and then we offer them to people as a resource, and we establish what's working, and we're constantly looking to build on that best practice by bringing people together to do that at every level, and particularly for our divisional commanders. They are people who have huge areas of responsibility. They're very senior in the organisation, but we invest with them time every month to bring them together, to talk about issues which are arising, to identify best practice. We invite all our divisional commanders each month to put forward a suggestion of something which might be something we could ask others to accept and take forward. And we work with the 3 assistant chief constables who are always on the road and out there. I wish I could almost offer them commission on the things that they bring back to the centre and say, this is working really well, let's have a look at that and see if it will work well elsewhere.
Feel free to do that.
You've talked there about how you're interacting with one another, but interaction with the public, which of course is key. And if the multi-member ward plans are going to work across the country as well as they have done or seem to have done in Legacy Grampian, how are you going to ensure that communities can interact the same way and feel included and happy as the community in Elgin was?
Again, we are working with our partners across the country, local authorities, through their arrangements individually, but also arrangements with COSLA and Solace, with chief executives, to identify best practice. We've had a number of workshops about partnership engagement as part of alongside the scrutiny arrangements, to identify how we, as joint partners in community planning partnerships and community councils, for example, can work together more effectively year on year. And we've seen, as we've done our consultation for the second year multi-member ward plans, I think the engagement arrangements which we've shared with partners have been more extensive than we saw in the first year of Police Scotland. So we're always looking for good ideas. One of the things that we've really taken forward this year, without losing our focus on that face-to-face engagement and communication with members of the public at that very local level, we've seen a real increase in our social media, our digital engagement, if you like, with people. And my thumbs aren't quite quick enough to be able to tweet myself, but I can see it's a really vibrant scene for people being able to give us feedback very immediately and very locally. And we have over 500,000 now followers through our social media channels.
I praise you for what you're doing, particularly with Twitter. There's no doubt about the interaction that there is. And, you know, I spend a lot of time retweeting the police in my own area, and I understand that that's often very helpful in terms of following up inquiries. Can I go just a little bit beyond? And Mr. Finney mentioned discretion. How much discretion is given to officers on the ground in terms of public interaction? I met with Mr. Thompson last week. I was giving them an example of in Aberdeen a difficulty which in some folks' minds is a pretty minor problem of cycling on pavements. And that was included in Operation Whitebeam, led by local officers in the Seaton area, who actually took members of the public out with them to see what they were doing. And that gave the folks the understanding of the difficulty sometimes that the officer in the ground had in dealing with this, and left the folks quite satisfied. How much discretion are you giving local officers to include members of the public in things like that, for example, which I think is extremely beneficial? Some would call it a PR job. I wouldn't call it that at all, but you know, I think that's really beneficial.
Well, thank you very much for raising it. I don't call it a PR job either. I call it tackling the issues which are important to people locally, and is exactly what our community officers are encouraged to do. They're encouraged to do that and be held accountable for it, because we go back to people and say, this is what you told us was a problem, this is what we've done to tackle it, this is what the result was. And we are doing, if you like, we're making it, I hope, easier for community officers to do that, because we're also increasing across the country the balance of people involved directly in community policing as community officers. Again, you know, Fife will be an example of this, but if we think just of this area here, Edinburgh City, you may have been aware earlier this year, the divisional commander here, because he wanted to continue to focus more effectively on local priorities, changed the balance of his resourcing between response policing, people who come to the 999 calls, and community policing, those people who are engaging directly with problem solving at a very local level. He increased the balance by 160 officers from response policing into community policing, which has moved his proportion of officers from around 30% to almost 50% officers now involved in community policing, doing exactly those sorts of things, which is talking to people at a very local level, identifying the issues that are important to them, which, if I'm very honest, will never appear in a national plan because they're not national issues. They are issues which are about being tackled locally, and they may change once we've successfully, perhaps with partners, dealt with a particular issue. There has to be room for us then to look at other issues locally and move on. And community teams have the flexibility and the discretion, as you put it, to do that.
Thank you. And my apologies again, I was in a debate in the miners' strike where policing issues did come up, but things have changed mercifully. Alison, followed by Graham.
Mr Patrick, you said that you were confident that policing remained very local in nature. The committee sought written evidence to our inquiry, and COSLA responded saying that following the reform, policing is more centralised and top-down, with national priorities such as stop and search and road traffic enforcement being imposed from above on local police commanders, thus creating a collision between national and local priorities. Do you want to comment on that?
Collision is not a word I would use to describe what is, I think, a natural, if you like, coming together of national priorities identified through a national consultation exercise, which we must remember is actually asking 31 people who all live somewhere locally, but we aggregate all of that, bring it together. We have to, of course, add in, using our professional judgment and mindful to the issues that are set for us around the Scottish Government priorities and also our police authority priorities, we have to add in a level of professional judgment and analysis, and things like counter-terrorism and tackling serious and organised crime have to come in at a national level because they don't generally appear at the local level. So we do that, but then at the very local level, we use that information and all the other things that local commanders and officers and staff do to identify local priorities. And we operate, of course, with a single policing plan for the whole of Scotland, 32 local authority level, local policing plans, and then 353, in fact, multi-member ward plans. They come together, but it's not what I would describe as a collision.
There are obviously only so many person hours in a shift. I mean, how do you actually prioritise the different and competing demands?
Well, I suppose what is the most effective way of doing that is ensuring that each individual officer or member of staff who's involved in any activity in Police Scotland understands the job they're being asked to do, understands how they contribute to keeping people safe, and wherever they work in Scotland is very effectively briefed and tasked about what it is we require them to do. So again, at this very local level, for the first time, at the multi-member ward level, I think for individual officers, they can be much more focused on things which are very immediate to them. I was out on patrol a couple of weeks ago with local officers in our Central Division, and we were talking about their briefing and tasking model, and what they said to me, the 3 or 4 officers I was talking with directly before we went out on patrol, was that they're very clear now. They're very clear about what's required of them locally, and they're very clear about how we are asking them to deliver that, and they're very clear about their discretion, but they're also very clear about what we expect them to achieve when they're doing it.
June, you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just one point around the targets that I thought was quite interesting, and that, you know, there are national targets, as the DCC has described, serious organised crime, violence, etc. And the majority of these we have found actually tailor nicely in with what the communities are telling us at ward level. But interestingly, there was 2 that didn't. One was speeding and one was drug dealing or drugs misuse, and simply all that me as a divisional commander had to do, and I know that every other divisional commander has done it, is we raised it to the the centre, if you like, to say these two issues are issues for us. Can they become targets for us? And that's exactly what happened. So it's actually a bit about the bottom, the local officers and the local communities identifying the targets, and we're actually saying to the Force Executive, we want these to be targets in Fife, and these are now targets in Fife. So it's a top-down, but also, very importantly, a bottom-up approach.
I might turn now then to stop and search and the rollout of that across Scotland. And I think many of us have been surprised at just the scale of the stop and search, especially that's carried out on the non-statutory basis. And I think some young people in certain areas of Scotland might well be thinking that it's disproportionate and excessive. And I'm particularly concerned about the impact on young people. Does the force have special guidelines covering the procedures that officers should use when engaging with very young people?
Thank you very much. The first thing I would say about our stop and search is that what we want everybody to do is to focus on the right places and the right times to reduce violence and other kinds of criminality. And so to be led by the intelligence, but also to do it in a way which fits entirely with our values, so that it's done fairly, with integrity and respectfully to the individuals involved. It's very important to me that that people understand that when we talk about the difference between what's described, it's not always helpfully, I don't think, as consensual stop and search and legislative stop and search, that all of it is legal. You know, we're very clear that there is a firm legal platform for it. But we also have, as well as the power to stop and search people, we have a responsibility, and individuals have rights. And particularly important, I think, is the point you make about young people. And I want young people to be very clear about their expectation should be every bit as high as anyone else, that they're treated respectfully and fairly, that what's happening is being explained to them. And so we've started to do some work as a single service now with young people's organisations. Notably, we're involving Young Scot, who we have a very good relationship with. We want to develop some, if you like, tools for young people to help get them involved in our training and the way that we do stop and search. That's already happening and has been happening perhaps for some years in some places in Scotland, but not consistently. And I think that's the value that we can add. It's, if you like, some of the best practice that we spoke about earlier that we can take from some places in Scotland and roll out across the country. But what I would also say is that when I talk to young people about stop and search, what I hear young people say is, I want you to do that because I don't want, when I go out on a Friday night, to worry about the knife in someone else's pocket. I want to know that those other people don't have a knife in their pocket. But if you stop and search me, I want to understand why me, and I want to understand that you're doing it respectfully. You're explaining what you're doing, and that's what we want to aim to achieve with stop and search. And we have recovered and continue to recover significant amounts of drugs and weapons across the country.
How do your officers ascertain that an informed consent to what you call a consensual search, which is one that doesn't have any statutory footing, has been given?
Well, we have guidelines for all our officers which explain, it's the toolkit, which is my shorthand for guidelines, which explain to people, to our officers, what our expectation is, that they must explain to people and they must engage with them in a way which helps, make sure that people understand why officers are taking that step. In consensual, in every stop and search, it's what happens as the result of an engagement between our officers and a member of the public. It's an extension of an encounter with them. And all of that involves talking to people. Only in very exceptional circumstances will there not be some sort of conversation, an explanation about what's happening in any encounter. It's particularly important, though, I think the point you make about young people, that we use language which is understandable and that young people themselves understand what their rights and expectations should be.
Is the young people that they have a right to refuse?
what we ask young people is for their consent, and we are very clear about doing that in relation to a consensual search.
For a young 10-year-old faced with an officer in uniform, asking them ever so nicely if it's all right to search them, to be able to resist that. But that's not informed consent necessarily.
And that's why it's very important with us to build on work that's been going on in some places around the country, but not everywhere, to work with young people's organisations to see how we can get even better at making sure that where we're doing that, we're doing it in a way that helps young people to understand what it is we're doing. And we have with us our sort of national lead here on Stop and Search, who I know is very keen to add to what I've said.
I just wanted, Convener, if I may, to put a bit of context around the whole Stop Search debate. In some sections of the media it's been reported as a new thing. In fact, it's not a new thing at all. The reality of the situation is, in fact, that Stop and Search volumes are actually down in the first year of Police Scotland. More searches were done under legacy force arrangements in total, so they're down about 4.6% this year. That's 29,000 fewer stop searches. But more importantly than raw numbers for me is the fact that we've really developed our intelligence products. We really take it seriously that we get our officers into the right places at the right times, searching the right people, so that we do actually bring those laminated words to life, keeping people safe. That's what we're about. And we do keep people safe, because that positive rate, if you like, of finding drugs, knives, weapons, stolen property, that has gone up significantly under Police Scotland with the improved training that we give, the new cloud analysis, getting our officers into the right place. It's gone up from something like 13%. In fact, it was 13.6% under legacy arrangements to 19.3% so far this year. That's a huge difference.
I got lost in the clouds. What was it?
Yeah, the number of our stop searches that result in items of stolen property, drugs, knives, etc. being found. So that can only be a good thing. When you look in the bigger...
Say that's 80% people stopped and searched and nothing.
Yes, stop and search is one tactic in a raft of policing measures that we use.
In the clouds, it's 80% of people have been stopped and nothing.
But that compares extremely well to the rest of the UK, and it's a huge improvement on last year.
On last year, yeah. What I would also say is that, of course, we also monitor feedback from the public, including, for example, complaints which may relate or do relate to stop and search. We've had so far this year, out of the 615,000 searches, which is a decrease on last year, stop and searches across the country, we've had 32 complaints. 32 complaints. That's one complaint per, now somebody worked this out for me, 19,000 stop and searches. We take all of them seriously, they're all recorded, they are all investigated appropriately, and that is the figure that we have. I would also say that, I mean, what we've seen...
Sorry, can we just stop here? I mean, are you happy that 80% are negative? I mean, that's the crux of it. I'm talking about civil liberties here, you know, and you're presenting it as it's not as bad as it used to be, but it's still 80% of people have been stopped and searched, and there's nothing. They're carrying nothing. They've got nothing offensive.
Them with no grounds for suspicion. Because if you had grounds for suspicion, you would be using your statutory powers.
Well, sorry, go on.
I could, to answer the question, I think yes is the answer. I am happy, and you know, every Monday and every Friday of every week in life, I get a map of Fife, and it shows me where the violence is, where the disorder is, and it shows me where my stop and searches, where my officers have been conducting the stop and searches. And as long as my officers are conducting the stop and searches in the right areas where violence is, I hope there is a reduction and we find less weapons, because the message is getting out in the areas of certain areas of Deprived and Fife that actually it's not safe to carry a weapon in there because you're going to get stopped and searched, and every weapon that my officers recover off the streets is one less injury to somebody that's walking about in that area, because he or she may not know by walking about in that area they may well get injured. So it's important that my officers are there doing it. One thing, just to try and provide some reassurances, what we do, and I know other areas we talk about best practice, and I can maybe finish on that, but we do work with the high schools. One high school a month in Fife, we arrange for the rector to get all the children, all the kids that have been stop and searched, and get them into a room if they choose to tell their guidance teachers.
Again, corral them.
But actually to sit with them as local officers and to try and understand how they felt. Did you understand why it was getting done, etc., etc.? And that feedback from the kids has been really positive, because they understand that actually it's not just about finding things, it's about deterring violence as well, and it's about deterring them being injured and hurt in certain areas where violence is very high level. So the feedback from the children and the teenagers is actually very positive. And just finally, the last thing, sorry about me, is the good practice part of it. Is I had a chief super from Ayrshire, Gillian MacDonald, my equivalent, who actually heard that that's what we were doing in Fife in relation to with the high schools, and she's been in touch in the question set, etc. So it touches on Mr Finney's question, I think, at the beginning about how do we share best practice around Scotland. These are some of the examples of how we're doing that. We don't want to disengage communities through stop and search, and that is the forefront of my mind and the officers that work with me, and that's the key element here.
The use of stop and search as a deterrent is some power that you've appropriated to yourself that I'm not at all sure is absolutely appropriate. There is a real risk that people are continually and repeatedly being stopped and searched. If what Mr McCune says is right, and indeed when we were in Glenrothes, we understood that you didn't map the prevalence, so you have no way of knowing how many times an individual has been stopped and at what point that can be considered harassment. So would you agree that it's important to have more robust figures that actually makes it clear who and when you're stopping?
Yes, I would agree. I would agree wholeheartedly, and Ms ACC Mawson will be able to describe to you the work that's going on now, that we've come together as a national service to develop a process and a system for us being able to do that. We're able to map geographically, but at the moment there is more opportunity for us to use that information to establish in terms of individuals, how often individuals are being stopped and searched, what the grounds for that are, and how we're using that information to reduce crime. And we want to do that. We want to go ahead and do it. And it's, that task has already gone out to establish how we can do that more effectively.
If Mr Wilson says that this is not a new thing, and we know that it's not a new thing, it's kind of mission creep that's been going on for many years, but that you haven't already actually carried that out, but it's heartening to know that it's being done now. Those statistics must be available to the public. You must be openly accountable on this issue. So do you intend to make those openly available?
We make the statistics that we currently have available through local scrutiny mechanisms and through our reporting to the police authority, through our accountability mechanisms. As we develop our systems, of course we can't talk about personal information, we wouldn't want to do that, but we would be working through our local scrutiny mechanisms and through the police authority to make that information available. Yes, we will.
But I just maybe one more question, I'm sure other people want to come in. Do your officers consider the refusing consent in itself suspicious, and do you then move on to formal stop and search if a young person was to decline?
If I may answer that question, not on its own, no. It's on a case-by-case basis is the way that we approach that. If there are a number of other factors that would raise the officer's suspicion, then it may be that it moves to a more statutory footing, but on its own, no is the answer.
Can I just, on a case-by-case basis, because when my colleague Alison McInnes and I visited your constabulary, your division now, one of the things that was concerning us and was raised by your officers was that streetcraft, as you call it, this reading individual case-by-case basis, it's all very well with officers who have a lot of experience, but some of the younger ones coming in might be more hot-blooded and look at being, coming in with a higher hit rate and things, and not have tact or subtleties or reading the body language or whatever in the same way. And that was raised by quite a few senior officers, well, not senior, but experienced officers in it. Are there concerns that if we have this almost what might be normality for children to be stopped now and searched? So that's maybe why they don't object, because it's kind of usual. It just happens. It's certainly, I would have objected. I can assure you, if I'd been somebody out in the street and stopped and searched, I'd said, no, I know my rights, and I'd probably got into more trouble for it. But, you know, the issue is, how do you read that? And are there concerns with this, what we may be concerned about in this committee, targets, hitting numbers, right numbers in different divisions, means that the younger ones come in and that's what they're out doing, and they haven't got the subtleties that perhaps more experienced officers have.
Yeah.
That was raised with us. It's not mine. It was raised with us.
I mean, I think the younger officers, if that was raised as an issue from the more senior, you know, these officers at the college in particular now, you know, are trained on. I mean, it's all about training. It's all about the ability to engage with members of the public, whether it be as a stop and search, whether it be as searching a house, whether it be of taking a child victim to a medical examination. There are sensitivities and there are tradecraft and ways that we have to be professional, and I would expect all my officers and all officers across Scotland to act professionally. Complaints is a good measure of that, because there have been no complaints in Fife, and 32, I think the DCC said, in Scotland, compared to the hundreds of thousands of stop and search, is a good indicator, but just one indicator. And that is why we're trying to do other ways to ask those people that are being stop and searched in the cold light of day, days, weeks after the stop and search has happened. Is there any lessons we could learn from that? How did you feel? Were you treated with respect and dignity?
My question, though, which was about the more experienced officers, had genuine concerns that officers just coming into the service would have a different culture from the way Police Scotland is now operating and look at being much more officious.
Okay, that's never been brought to my attention from the more senior officers. The only other thing I would say is that targets, the younger officers don't have targets in relation to stop and search or targets for anything. So if there is this perception that they're trying to achieve a target, they don't have a target, so they shouldn't be trying to achieve that.
And it is something that we continually update our guidance and guidelines to people, the toolkit that I've just spoken about, telling people about how best to do these things. It's something that is included in officer training. And although they all look very young to me, the average age of people joining the service now is 27. So they are people who've come with other life skills and have been involved in different sorts of things. So what I'm very keen on is also making sure that supervisors at the very local level understand and take responsibility for the professionalism of all our officers, including those directly under their command. And we've been involved very recently in a series of extra briefings and guidelines to all our sergeants about what's expected of them as they brief and task officers around reducing violence and other sorts of crime across Scotland. And we're reinforcing that again with our sergeants' training. So it's not just the constables, it's their immediate supervisors who are with them, if you like, whatever the shift.
So the concerns of experienced officers are ill-founded or misplaced, which is certainly, I think, Alison, you would agree with me, was put to us quite firmly by just not more than one officer.
I don't have any evidence of that happening. What I do feel reassured at is that officers who have longer service understand they have a responsibility to make sure that officers with less service are well supported in doing the job they do and understand our expectation of them.
Thank you very much, Convener. First of all, I'd record my admiration for what working officers do every day on our behalf and the staff who support them, and indeed the group who are here today, because I think all too often when we question what's going on, it's seen as a criticism, and it's not. Our purpose in life is to poke the system and see if what you've described here today is what's happening out there, reality. And I've got to tell you that if, as you've described it today, was a reality out here, we wouldn't have this meeting today. We wouldn't be discussing it. So COSLA have raised issues about consultation. There's been comments from West Lothian, Dumfries and Galloway, Moray. There's been input from older officers about how they perceive the system working and so forth. So it's not in the ether there that we produced some of these questions. And I had no intentions of touching stop and search, but I think we need to take on board too that in the last 20 years or so, we've got 500,000 fewer younger people out there in the streets of Scotland, because unfortunately we're an ageing population. So I must admit that I sometimes sit thinking the young ones who are left out there have got a busy day with the number of stop searches that are ongoing. The one bit that did concern me was the fact that where negative searches were achieved, the details of those who were subject of those searches weren't recorded as a matter of course. And I think that that's a real concern for the future. The art and the science of stop search, I think you've already discussed, and I'll leave that alone and move on to other topics. The consultation bit is one I wanted to consider in the context of local policing and delivering the kinds of ideas that you've played out today. We've gone through a process of consultation. The counter closures, for instance, were subject of consultation, and I know that having spoken to Mr Naylor, who led on that part of the debate and the plan, I made it clear to him that if there was no public interest in the matter, it certainly wasn't for me to leave offices open that weren't required. So that was never going to be the process. But we'd need to be assured that the consultation had been conducted effectively and that we knew where we stood. The same applied to control rooms across the country and what was happening there. And indeed, only last week at Unison, I was told by members of Unison staff that they've been assured that they would be consulted and kept advised. And what they said to me at the Unison conference last week from the floor was that the first advice they got was in the Daily Record, and that was only a few weeks ago in relation to the work that they did. Then we had the traffic warden situation. We've had the warrants and citations situation. So there's two questions there that arise for me. One is about the genuine consultation and how much is heard before the decision is taken and stamped on. And then secondly, the impact thereafter when these things happen on those officers who are left to fill in the spaces that have been delivered. The final thing I would say is more current, and apparently there was, or still is, a group which exists in central Scotland.
Is this off consultation?
It is.
Could we just do the
well,
consultation? No, I'll get you back in with your next question.
No, but this is part of the consultation. The Priority Crime Unit is a group of civilian staff who did investigation, and only 4 years ago were applauded and awarded a prize for their good work because they delivered improved investigation, better quality of service, increased frontline capacity and best value. It's now being ended, ceased, and those staff members have been given voluntary redundancy. How do you deal with consultation and all these aspects where it's quite evident the subject of the outcomes feel that they weren't consulted and their views had no impact?
Can we divide it into
yes, and I'll leave it at that.
No, into consultation with the public and consultation with people associated with the force, yes, either in uniformed or civilian capacity, different kinds of consultations. Yes. So, first of all, consultation with the public, please.
Well, actually, they are things, when we're talking about some of the change projects which you've referred to, are things that we need to balance. We have a statutory and employment responsibility in legislation as an employer to our staff to consult with them about changes that may affect them, and we have to balance that with our responsibility and our desire to consult with the public about how we deliver those very sort of front-facing services. Those two things, I won't say that they are in conflict, but it's often challenging to balance those things when you're talking about wanting to let our staff know that we are going to start reviewing or start developing proposals before we let anybody else know, because we're their employer and that's our responsibility. we're doing different sorts of consultation with the public, if I start there effectively, because of course we're consulting with the public through our surveys and other work about the priorities that they think are important to them and which we want to address. And we're also consulting with them about some of the ways in which we organise ourselves to meet those priorities. So, for example, our front counter service. Now, one thing I've learnt about consultation over the years is that wherever we do it, whenever any public service does it, we always wish that we'd had several years more than we did to actually consult, and that we'd been able to do it in many, many more ways than we had actually done it. Every public service will tell you the same thing, and it's always true. We have listened to what the public have said to us, and we've made changes to some of the major things that you've described there. So, for example, our front counter service. We talked to people about what we had gathered in terms of information about usage of our front counters. We developed some proposals. We talked to our staff. We put those proposals out for public consultation, and we amended those proposals. We amended opening hours. We amended the number of counters which would no longer offer a front counter service. And we did that as a result of the consultation that we had, and views from not only from the public but from our staff. We also, and I think it arose as a result of this kind of conversation, we had a defined period for consultation, and as that came to a close, we made it clear that we would continue to take people's views while we were processing the amount of information we'd had through the formal consultation process. We kept that open for, I think, almost another six weeks as a result of that.
You certainly asked about that, and that was part of the undertaking given.
That's right.
Not to be too sensitive on the issue, we were told it wasn't maintained open. The consultation process had closed, but you would still hear some of the views, which I thought was a bit small-minded in a response, I've got to say, because it was open.
What I hope is, well, what in fact happened was that the public was still able to, and partners were still able to give us their views, and we took those into account for that much longer period than we had previously planned to do. We started we wrote out to people, I think in June last year, about our front counter service. And so throughout that period, we've been talking to our staff about plans and encouraging them to come up with, back to the best practice and good ideas, encouraging them to help us shape those plans for the future, as well as asking the public. So would we always, in every form of consultation, start earlier than we actually did? We would have loved to do that. Did we keep it going as long as we could and continue to take views from people, including our staff? Yes, we did. Is it a time for our staff where we have a number of people who are, how can I put this? We have a number of people who, at the moment, are concerned about how they will be able to continue to deliver great service with all their skills and experience in a new organisation. And we are talking to them and their representatives, including Unison. You'll know at the Unison conference, the Chief Constable spoke directly to Unison about proposals and about how things are going. So we've got a number of staff with different needs at the moment, and we're doing our best to be as sensitive as possible to that, working with the staff associations. We have people who have put in for and want to take advantage of our voluntary redundancy and early retirement schemes. In many cases, we're saying to people, we can't afford to lose your skills and experience because the service we're building for the future needs you. And in other places, we're saying to people, because of course we have no compulsory redundancy, we are designing a new service, you want to stay, and we're designing you into that service. So it's a very complex picture at the moment, and we're mindful at all of that we need to make sure we're meeting the needs of both of those groups of staff.
And given the commitment that we've had from Police Scotland, it's about putting police officers out there in the street. I'll quote directly from the example of the unit that I mentioned from Stirling. They were congratulated on the work which was being carried out to free up more officers to work on the streets and in communities throughout the force area. And therefore, in that context, the logic of getting more officers in the street, and yet you're taking away people from the back office facilities, what we did gather from our various visits to the areas were that people on the street felt that they were being pulled in various directions, and it was difficult to commit to their local community needs because they were back office, let's stay away from the back, doing other duties, which took them away from the street side, whatever those duties were. How are you going to balance that? And if it wasn't for the need to deliver the £63 million savings, would a priority for the force have been, let's move on a lot of our support staff and rid ourselves of these places? Would that have been your priority? Or would you have sought a more balanced police family?
Well, what I would say is that we would never think of and I know it's not what you meant, we'd never think of ridding ourselves of people, you know, who are doing a very good job for us, and I know that's not what you meant. We have to operate within our budget. We have a budget, we're a responsible public service, we have to operate within it. We have an opportunity, of course, as a single service, to think about economies of scale, to support local policing, and colleagues who are involved in some of our sort of centralised functions, if you like, as any big organisation has those functions, finance functions, procurement, HR and so on, are organising themselves in a way where we still get a great service from that, but we're taking economies out of it as well. What we have as a single service is an opportunity not only for economies of scales, but to think about how we modernise for the future too and deliver a more effective service. All of that we have to do within our budget, and there will be things, there'll be opportunities we have out of that, and there'll be areas where we can't scale up what is an existing arrangement in one part of the country under legacy force arrangements to the rest of the country. But we will still deliver a great service without doing it in that particular way.
We discussed the I6 at our last subcommittee meeting, and you would acknowledge that in modernising the service, in the normal role of things, one would like to think that that provision It's local police. No, but I'm talking about local.
No, I know you're very
facility.
Cute. Slow down. You're very cute at weaving something else into it. But what I want to do is park I6 just now. I'm mindful of the time. You started almost in time. Yeah. So if we keep focus on that.
No, I'm not interested in the I6 part.
Well, why did you mention it?
Because what I'm saying is you would want the IT to be in place so that when you modernise the service, you get more for less.
That's still weaving it in. No, I'm ruling that.
Okay.
We're not here to talk about I6.
I've made my point.
You've not made your point. You've made me cross. Now I'm moving on to Margaret, who's been very patient.
I wonder if I could ask you and press you a little bit more on Central Scotland's Priority Crime Unit, because it seemed to me that was a very good local unit there. And to quote the Cabinet Secretary, with its specially trained civilian members of staff, working with police officers, then this initiative can help more police officers become part of the fabric of communities they serve and can free up police officers to concentrate on more serious crime. So can I have a confirmation it's closing? And while we're looking, of course, working at our budget, it seems to me that this is something that's working very well, that is a preventative measure. And rather than, scaling up, or we can't scale up, shouldn't that be exactly what you're doing if this works very well?
I'm really glad to hear members of staff described in such glowing terms for the good job that they've done. And of course, as individuals, they will have done that. When we look across the functions which are available to us to deliver to the public, I mentioned earlier on about the way that we are shifting, if you like, the balance so that we can still meet our in local policing, we can still meet our response policing responsibilities, but we want to get as many officers as we can into community policing, what we would all describe as community teams, based very locally, focused on local priorities, available to the public and available to reduce crime and keep people safe at whatever the most appropriate time of the day or day of the week is. In that model, we're looking at our community-based officers doing a range of things. We're asking them to respond to some of those calls for service, which previously would have been done by response policing officers. And we're also asking them to get involved, if you like, with the investigation of crime and problem solving related to that at a very local level. That rebalancing enables us to have, for example, community investigation units in local policing, which will be doing some of the kind of work that the team that you've just been describing has previously done, will now be done by police officers, not taken from somewhere on the street out to do that, but actually doing it as part of their community-based work and policing on the streets. So looking at it from afresh, looking at it in good practice around the country, of course that was an example of good practice under those legacy arrangements. It's not exclusively good practice which we have to adopt, because we are going to do that kind of work in a different way, based around and using our community investigation units and our community-based officers. And I think those arrangements, I mean, ACC McCormick will be able to describe a little bit more about the transition, about how we're doing that. But it fits with the model that we've described, which is rebalancing and moving as many officers as we can into these community policing and community investigation units across Scotland.
DCC Fitzpatrick, you seem to have described something that was working very well at local level, and because we're now a national police force, that has no longer any relevance. And the fact of the matter is the civilian investigating staff that worked so well with the police officer and were delivering good results now feel that they're almost compulsorily made redundant because there is no equivalent job for them. But moving on, just to talk a little bit...
Well, you might want to answer that first, in fairness, if you made the point, then you can move on, yes.
Well, I'm going to invite Mr McCormick to describe the transitional arrangements around that particular team, as you've raised it, but it's a point I made
Before
earlier.
Before you go into the transitional arrangements, could you address their performance?
Don't talk over each other, please. You've accused. There's been an accusation. You want to answer that?
What I wanted to say was that we have no compulsory redundancy arrangements for people who work for us in police in Scotland.
What I was saying, DCC.
There are none. We have for voluntary redundancy and early retirement schemes to people. And anyone who doesn't want to take advantage of those schemes, we are finding that we are able to deploy their skills elsewhere in the organisation. They're much sought after people with a lot of experience and skills, and we want to carry on having them do a good job for us.
So if you're already using these investigators, civilian staff, why change the arrangement?
Well, could we hear perhaps from, I think it is ACC McCormick, are you going to answer that part?
If I could, ma'am, yeah, that would be helpful. Yes, we did have the priority crime unit in Forth Valley, as we now know Central Scotland Police as a division, 2 civilian coordinators and 10 investigators. I think, though, it's worth recognising the context in which that group was introduced and the comparison now. So at that time, Central Scotland Police did not have the uplift in police numbers that were provided as part of the extra 1,000 officers for Scotland. And the also, we're dealing with a higher volume of what we described as volume crime. Priority crime at that time was seen as being vandalism, minor housebreaking, car crime. These are issues which have seen a significant reduction. So if we see the demand profile, and in fact there's the notion of it being a priority crime unit, well actually where our priorities are seen to lie now, as opposed to where they lay at the time at which that unit was formulated, have changed. So actually it's become clear to us it's more useful for us to have fully empowered police officers who, as the DCC described, as part of the community investigation unit, can do the full gambit or ambit of police investigation, and of course then be visible on the street and add to the police presence on the street, which we know that communities find very valuable. So actually the role that that team did has diminished because of the change in the crime profile, and there is a genuine value add for us about having a consistency in how we do things across the country, because we do have expert crime assistants coming in and major investigation teams, etc., who will come and support local policing. And if there are an additional set of people doing a different function, which is unusual and unique to that area, that is a little bit uncomfortable for the model. But actually, I believe that it's quite clear we can get better value out of using police officers now in the context of where we are now, as opposed to the context at which the priority crime unit was introduced, at which point it very much was a very appropriate thing.
That leads me quite neatly, Convener, onto the other concern we have. And when I fully understand the hierarchy will want to see targets to judge and analyse performance, then when we went out to police officers and talked to them, then they said now that it was performance-led policing, and the reference to Mr McCormick's, we now have different priorities. There was now a silo approach, whereas previously there'd been intelligence gathering, not necessarily out there in the street, but talking to communities and spending time doing that, gathering, analysing information and working out a strategy, all of which led to very, very effective preventative policing as opposed to response policing or looking necessarily at targets which are not perhaps a priority in an area. And I think that would be the concern about abandoning this unit, and the concern that is very much on the ground from the police that we've talked to.
Well, I think I would go back to what I said at the beginning when I spoke about how do we know whether, I have to ask myself, how do I know whether under a national service, with our commitment to local policing remaining very local in nature, we're making a difference and we are, and our officers are enabled to do the job that they do as well as they possibly can. The bottom line for us is, are we actually keeping people safer? Well, we know that we are. We know that individual officers, because we're able to provide them with intelligence, because we're able to focus and brief them around the priorities that that have been set for them by the public, that's having a good effect. The officers that you met around the country have been instrumental in making sure that there are over 700 fewer victims of violence across Scotland this year so far, that, as I described it, antisocial behaviour and disorder incidents are down 50,000 to 60,000 in 11 months against the same period last year. So those officers, the focus of those officers on what they do every day, based on intelligence and briefing, not having to worry about individual targets because they're not set individual targets, is being really effective. Of course, we've been able to build on the legacy arrangements that we had under 8 previous forces, but our approach to local policing under a single service, able to identify, as we've talked about previously, what's working well around the country and offer that to local officers wherever they are, with the full support of a great deal of specialist asset, whether that is helicopter, whether it's a major inquiry team, whether it's dogs to search for missing persons or drugs or recover stolen property, or in fact if it's to address a local initiative and lever in some extra people from other places in Scotland to support them. All of that is available now and the results speak for themselves.
Before you go, Margaret, I just want to warn everybody, I've got less than 5 minutes. I'll be very brief. So if you're brief, and I'll try to let Rod in, and then I'll get questions from John and Alison. If they're not able to be answered in that time, I'll ask for written answers so that you've got it on the record. I must stop so we get this concluded at the right time. Right, Margaret, sorry.
We did get feedback. There are occasions when pulling on the national resources were very helpful, and I wouldn't like to think it was all negative. But I think, DCC Fitzpatrick, I would have been a lot more encouraged today, rather than you telling me that you've got this entirely right, hierarchy has looked at it, and this is all trickling down very nicely to the ground. You had taken some of these concerns and said, well, if it was preventative work the officers felt they were doing before, and now they don't feel they're doing that and they are more reacting, I would like to know and learn from that. And I haven't heard that today.
Can I just leave that? You can reply to that. It'll be a long answer, I suspect, but some of which you've already given us. But it's on the record so we can get the answers. I'd like to get Rod an opportunity to join us.
Very
special guest appearance.
Thanks very much, Convener. No, it's a very small point. I just really wanted some clarity. We've talked a lot, Mrs. Fitzpatrick, about kind of local policing. But to what extent are community officers less locally based than they were prior to Police Scotland coming into force? I mean, are community hubs pulling local policemen away?
Police officers across Scotland are based locally. There isn't, every community, and particularly through our social media now, can identify its individual local officers. I can, through our website, for example, if you're unclear about who your local officers are or how to contact them, you can put in your postcode. So,
of where they're based, they're coming in from somewhere else, is where previously they were based in place A. Yeah.
Do you mean resident?
Well, no, operational.
I'm sorry, understanding. Well, I mean, officers...
Certainly, understand the position in Fife, that's changed. Although, according to this report, the number of community officers in the local areas remained the same, but they're operating in a slightly different way.
Yes.
I mean, from a Fife perspective... From a Fife perspective, we've grown our community officers by about 53, I think it was at the last count, to a 55% response officers, 44% community. So we've actually increased our community officers. What we have done, and I think you may be talking around this, is our response. What we have done is our response officers, we have hubbed them to make sure that there's greater resilience there to respond to grade 1 and 2. Our community officers are still within their local communities, still responding to the local community concerns within, whether it be Cooper, St Andrews, etc., etc. So the community officers are still there, but we are in the process of hubbing our response officers.
Doesn't accord with the information I'm getting on the ground.
Can I just pick up the point about officers? I mean, we still have the same number of operational police buildings across Scotland as we inherited under legacy arrangements. We haven't closed any of those. One of the things we do is look at, of course, response times, the opportunity that we have to deploy officers quickly and effectively, and make sure that that is spread across the country. So we monitor how long it takes us to get to incidents in the way that's been described, but we also make sure that we've got our officers deployed throughout those operational buildings, so that effectively they're in the communities that they're serving. But there will be, of course, from time to time, we'll reorganise or reorder that to give as good a service as we can.
It's being suggested in part of my constituency that whereas officers were previously based in one part, they now come from elsewhere, although the police station remains, but they're not actually, that police station has not actually been in active use in the same way that it was. So that the offices are less local.
If that's a particular issue.
No, but in the interest of time, could you perhaps give us more detail of that, and we can put it in either... I think we better put it in letter form, because you can give us the detail. Yeah. I want your question on the record, John and Alison, and then we'll put them in a letter as well to embrace, is that what I mean? Rod's question. John.
I understand there's case law regarding blanket searching in relation to misuse of drugs in the past, offensive weapons. Can I commend a booklet to you that Northern Constabulary used to issue to young people called Know Your Rights? I noticed that the question that my colleague Alison asked about, do you tell people that they're not requiring to submit to a search, which will have implications for complaints, and in any case you wouldn't be able to evidence complaints. If you could look at that, please. I think the more knowledge people have, the better. And finally, can I say, I don't see this as being rocket science. How many folk did you search in the shift? 4. How many were successful? 2, whatever. It doesn't need fancy IT systems to give you these details.
Okay?
I would like some further information on the reduction in participation in local diversionary projects, and in many cases the withdrawal from things like road safety education. So I'm thinking of diversionary projects like midnight football leagues, where local officers were actively involved in those, and I understand now no longer at all involved. So I'd like to understand the rationale for those changes.
Right. Now these... Can't answer them just now. We have to have a guillotine on it, because we've got to finish by 14:25, because the chamber sits again. Can I thank you very much for your evidence? We'll put these questions perhaps in a more detailed form in a letter to you for further explanation. Letters published, your response will be published. Thank you very much for your attendance. I take it now move into private session. I'm sorry, I'm going to move straight on and say we have to move into private session. I ask everybody to...